For centuries of European royal history, same-sex desire was a death sentence, or at least a shameful secret that had to be buried deep beneath layers of heavy velvet and silence. Kings were forced to wear masks. They had to play the role of model husbands, of stoic warriors, acting out a rigid performance to protect the throne. But in 1715, that rule was shattered by a man who dared to challenge both God and prejudice. He was not a sneaking courtier hiding in the shadows. He held the absolute power of France in the palm of his hand. He was the man who turned the Palais Royal into a sanctuary of sexual freedom, where the boundaries between male and female were blurred in a haze of champagne. Contemporaries called him a libertine, a disgrace to the Bourbon blood, but modern history calls him by a more accurate name, the only openly bisexual prince to ever rule a major European power. Welcome to the scandalous, tragic, and deadly seductive life of Philippe II d'Orléans, the queerest regent in the history of France. Philippe did not spring from a vacuum. He was the product of the golden cage of the Sun King, Louis XIV. Growing up beside the rigid piety of his uncle, Philippe witnessed a starkly contrasting model in his own father, Monsieur. A brave warrior on the battlefield, who famously donned women's gowns at balls and openly loved men, Monsieur taught Philippe that masculinity was a performance, and that one could be a lion in war while being a lover of men. Inheriting this duality along with a terrifying intellect for the sciences, young Philippe grew into a voracious libertine, a chaotic force whose brilliance deeply unsettled the controlling nature of the king. The tension culminated when Louis XIV forced Philippe to marry the king's own illegitimate daughter to stain the Orléans bloodline. Yet, on his wedding night, Philippe staged a breathtaking act of defiance. He performed his dynastic duty with his new wife for a mere 10 minutes before leaving to spend the rest of the night with a male lover. This act declared that while the king could command his politics, he could not command his desire. Cast aside and later falsely accused of being a poisoner when the royal heirs began to die, Philippe became a pariah, a prince of bad reputation waiting for the axe to fall. However, fate reversed entirely on September 1st, 1715, when the Sun King finally died, leaving the throne to a frail 5-year-old. Despite Louis XIV's final attempt to strip him of power from the grave, Philippe marched into the Parlement of Paris with the confidence of a conqueror. Through charm, intimidation, and sheer political genius, he tore up the late king's will and seized the regency. The man once reviled as a sodomite and a sorcerer was now the absolute master of France, officially opening the door to an era of unprecedented freedom and scandal. The sun had set on the grand century, and as the heavy gold-embroidered curtains of Versailles were drawn against the light, a strange, frantic energy began to seize the French capital. The funeral of Louis XIV was a somber, majestic affair, a final procession for a god who had walked the earth. But the moment the crypt at Saint-Denis was sealed, the collective exhale of the nation was audible. For 72 years, France had been holding its breath, standing at rigid attention, terrified of making a mistake. Now the drill sergeant was gone, and in his place stood Philippe II d'Orléans, a man who didn't care if your wig was straight, provided your conversation was interesting. The transfer of power was physical. Under Louis XIV, the center of the universe was Versailles. Paris, the actual capital, was treated like a dirty, rebellious child, ignored and feared by the monarch. Philippe hated Versailles. He found it drafty, expensive, and haunted by the ghosts of etiquette. One of his first acts as regent was to pack up the king, the 5-year-old Louis XV, and move the entire court back to Paris. The Tuileries Palace became the official residence of the child king, but the real seat of power was just down the street, at Philippe's ancestral home, the Palais Royal. This geographic shift changed everything. Versailles was a stage built for solo performance. The Palais Royal was a theater in the round, surrounded by the chaotic, vibrant life of the city. The gates were thrown open. The gardens became a public park where dukes rubbed shoulders with pickpockets and where the air smelled of roasting chestnuts and scandal. It was here, in the autumn of 1715, that Philippe began what historians would later call the liberal regency. But liberal is a polite political term. In reality, it was a moral revolution. Philippe was not a democrat. He believed in his divine right to rule as much as his uncle did. But he was a man of the Enlightenment. He did not believe that the state had any business in the bedroom. While he could not openly rewrite the laws of the kingdom, sodomy was still technically a capital offense, punishable by burning at the stake. He possessed the supreme power of enforcement, and he chose quite deliberately to turn the machine off. We can trace this silent policy shift in the dusty ledgers of the Lieutenant General of Police. For decades, a specialized unit of police spies had prowled the Tuileries gardens and the shadowy arcades of Paris, hunting for infidels to nature. Under the previous reign, men were entrapped, arrested, and quietly disappeared into the Bastille or Bicêtre prison, their lives ruined for the crime of loving other men. When Philippe took the reins, the ink in these ledgers dried up. The spies were recalled or reassigned to watch for Spanish plots rather than bedroom secrets. Between 1715 and 1723, the number of arrests for sodomy among the aristocracy dropped to absolute zero. It was a remarkable unannounced amnesty. Philippe did not issue a proclamation. That would have been political suicide. He simply created a climate where the police knew that the regent would not look kindly on the persecution of people who shared his own Italian tastes. The message rippled through the nobility instantly. The closet doors of the French aristocracy didn't just open, they were taken off their hinges. Men who had spent years cultivating false reputations as ladies' men suddenly appeared at the opera with their male favorites. The tension that had defined the court, the fear of being found out, evaporated. In its place came a frenzied pursuit of pleasure that bordered on hysteria. But if the relaxation of the laws was a quiet signal, Philippe's staffing decisions were a screaming declaration. The governance of France required a steady hand, and Philippe, contrary to his reputation as a lazy hedonist, was a tireless worker. He rose at 6 a.m, chugging a cup of bitter chocolate, and worked on state papers until the late afternoon. But he needed a right-hand man. He needed a prime minister. The man he chose was the Abbé Guillaume Dubois. To the conservative establishment, this was an abomination. Dubois was the son of a village apothecary, a man of low birth and even lower morals. He had been Philippe's tutor, the man who had supposedly corrupted the young prince's soul, introducing him to atheism and debauchery. Dubois was physically repulsive, described by contemporaries as looking like a ferret that had fallen into a barrel of vinegar, and his greed was legendary. But he was also a political genius, a diplomat of supreme cunning, and most importantly, the regent's most enduring love. Their relationship was the subject of endless speculation. Was it sexual? The pamphlets of the time had no doubt. They depicted Dubois and Philippe in every conceivable position. But even if the sexual component had faded into a comfortable intimacy by 1715, the emotional bond was unbreakable. Philippe trusted Dubois more than any prince of the blood. He elevated this pimp in a cassock to the Council of State. Later, he would force the Pope to make Dubois a cardinal, and eventually he named him Prime Minister of France. It was a staggering subversion of hierarchy. In the eyes of the pious, it was as if the Roman Emperor Caligula had made his horse a senator. Only in this case, the horse was a bisexual apothecary's son who ran a network of spies and procured lovers for the ruler. The elevation of Dubois was Philippe's way of saying that talent and loyalty mattered more than birth or virtue. It was a meritocracy of the marginalized. With the government running, however controversially, Philippe turned his attention to the atmosphere of his court. He wanted to erase the gloom of the previous century. He wanted light, he wanted noise, and he wanted novelty. The Regent style was born. The heavy, oppressive furniture of Louis XIV, with its straight lines and massive gold ornamentation, was thrown out. In came curves, lightness, comfort. Chairs were designed not for sitting upright in the presence of a king, but for lounging in conversation with a lover. The art changed, too. The grand battle scenes were replaced by the fêtes galantes of Watteau, dreamy pastel landscapes where beautiful ambiguous figures flirted in the twilight. But the true heartbeat of the Regency was the petit souper, the little supper. Every evening at 5 o'clock, the gates of the regent's private apartments in the Palais Royal were locked. The guards were dismissed, the secretaries were sent home. For the next 8 hours, the Regent of France ceased to exist, and Philippe the man took over. These suppers became the stuff of legend, whispered about in every court in Europe. They were small gatherings, usually no more than 20 people. The guest list was a mix that would have given Louis XIV a stroke. There were princes of the blood, yes, but they sat next to opera singers, actresses, and lower-ranking officers who had caught the regent's eye. The qualification for entry was not rank, it was wit. If you were boring, you were out. If you were beautiful and amusing, you were in, regardless of your pedigree. To ensure absolute privacy, Philippe banished the servants. He didn't want the eyes of the help judging him or selling stories to the gossip rags. The dining room was outfitted with a mechanical table that descended through the floor to the kitchen below, reappearing laden with food and wine so that no waiter needed to enter the room. It was a technological marvel designed for the sole purpose of uninhibited debauchery. Inside this sealed chamber, the rules of gender and propriety were suspended. The wine flowed, specifically a sparkling wine from the Champagne region that Philippe popularized. Before the Regency, champagne was a novelty. Philippe made it the official drink of celebration, the fuel for his nightly escapes. The accounts of these suppers, pieced together from the memoirs of those who survived them, paint a picture of chaotic brilliance. They were not mere orgies, though they often ended that way. They were verbal battlegrounds. The guests debated the existence of God. Philippe was a vocal atheist, the nature of the soul, and the latest scientific discoveries. They roasted the hypocrisy of the church and the stupidity of the nobility. And of course, they explored the spectrum of desire. Philippe presided over it all like a benevolent drunk Bacchus. He was known to bring his current mistress, the Comtesse de Parabère, a woman of striking beauty and endless patience. But sitting across from her might be a young musketeer or a handsome page boy. Philippe made no distinction. He would affectionately refer to his male companions as his roués, and the physical intimacy in the room was fluid. A hand on a knee, a kiss on the neck. It mattered little whether the recipient was male or female. One of the most striking features of this inner circle was the way the women adopted the freedom of the men. The Duchess of Berry, Philippe's daughter, was often present. She was the dark star of the Palais Royal. Recently widowed, she had no intention of marrying again. She took lovers as she pleased, ate voraciously, and drank the men under the table. She began to style herself as a warrior princess, sometimes wearing riding habits that mimicked military uniforms. In the Palais Royal, the rigid gender binary of the 17th century began to dissolve. Women claimed sexual agency. Men claimed the right to be decorative and emotional. However, outside the velvet-lined walls of the supper room, France was teetering on the brink of ruin. The wars of Louis XIV had left the treasury empty. The debt was astronomical. The people were starving. Philippe knew that all the champagne in the world couldn't fix a bankrupt nation. He needed a miracle. And because he was a man who loved risk, he didn't look for a traditional solution. He looked for a gambler. Enter John Law. Law was a Scottish economist, a professional gambler, and a fugitive who had killed a man in a duel in London. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a revolutionary idea: paper money. In a world where wealth was measured only in heavy gold and silver coins, Law proposed a system of credit, a national bank, and shares in a trading company. It was the birth of modern capitalism, and it was as radical and dangerous as Philippe's sexual politics. Philippe and Law were kindred spirits. They were both outsiders, both visionaries, and both addicted to the thrill of the new. Philippe gave Law the keys to the French economy. They established the Banque Générale and the Mississippi Company. They told the French people that the swamps of Louisiana were filled with mountains of gold. The result was the first great stock market bubble in history, the Mississippi Bubble. For a few delirious years, Paris went insane with greed. Shares in the company skyrocketed. Servants became millionaires overnight. Duchesses sold their diamonds to buy paper stock. The street outside Law's bank, the Rue Quincampoix, became a churning mosh pit of speculation. People from all walks of life, bishops, prostitutes, generals, butchers, crammed into the narrow alley screaming to buy. Philippe watched it all from the Palais Royal with a mixture of amusement and pride. He had seemingly solved the unsolvable. The debt was being paid off. Money was flowing. The economy was booming. It seemed that his philosophy of absolute freedom worked in economics just as well as it did in the bedroom. But the higher the bubble rose, the more detached the Regency became from reality. The wealth was illusory, printed on paper, backed by nothing but confidence in the regent and his Scottish wizard. And while the rich got richer, the poor watched the carriages of the newly wealthy splash mud on their rags. The resentment began to build. The pamphlets returned nastier than before. They no longer just called Philippe a sodomite. They called him a thief who was looting the nation to pay for his male whores and his incestuous feasts. The shadows were lengthening. The party had been raging for 3 years, but the hangover was approaching. And in the center of the storm, the tragedy that would define Philippe's life, the destruction of his beloved daughter, was slowly, inevitably taking shape. The queer utopia of the Palais Royal was built on a foundation of secrets, and secrets have a way of exploding. If the year 1719 could be distilled into a sound, it would be the roar of a crowd. It was a roar that started in the narrow, crooked alleyway of the Rue Quincampoix in Paris, the epicenter of John Law's financial miracle, and echoed all the way to the gilded ceilings of the Palais Royal. But as the months wore on, the timbre of that roar changed. It shifted from the hysterical laughter of easy wealth to the guttural scream of a mob realizing they had been cheated. And standing on the balcony, looking down at the chaos he had unleashed, was Philippe d'Orléans. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, We must first appreciate the sheer scale of the mania. Under Philippe's patronage, John Law's system had turned Paris into a casino. The shares of the Mississippi Company had started at 500 livres. By late 1719, they were trading at 10,000. It was mass hysteria. The social order collapsed. There are records of a hunchback in the Rue Quincampoix who made a fortune simply by renting out his hump as a writing desk for stock traders to sign contracts on. Dukes were bowing to footmen who had bought in early. The word millionaire was coined for the first time in history right here to describe this new breed of paper-rich Parisians. Philippe loved it. It was the ultimate disruption. He saw it as a triumph of modernity over the old dusty feudalism of his uncle's reign. He had liberated the bodies of the French from the church's morality, and now he had liberated their wallets from the constraints of gold. But Philippe, for all his brilliance, had a fatal flaw. He believed that because he was rational, the mob would be too. He forgot that fear is a stronger currency than hope. In early 1720, the bubble burst. It started with a whisper. Prince de Conti, Philippe's own cousin, drove 3 wagons to the bank and demanded to exchange his paper notes for hard gold. Then others followed. The confidence evaporated. The value of the shares plummeted like a stone dropped down a well. The streets that had been filled with cheers were now filled with riots. People were crushed to death in the stampede to get their money out of the bank. 50 people died in a single day, their bodies laid out in front of the Palais Royal as a grim protest against the regent. The hero became the villain overnight. The good regent was now the tyrant. And when the public turns on a ruler, they don't just attack his policies, they attack his soul. They looked for a reason why God was punishing France. They looked at the Palais Royal, at the lights burning late into the night, at the men coming and going from the regent's bedroom, and they decided that the financial rot was just a symptom of a deeper moral rot. The atmosphere in Paris turned poisonous, and the target of the most vicious poison was not Philippe himself, but the person he loved most in the world, his eldest daughter, Marie-Louise Elizabeth, the Duchess of Berry. We must pause here to look at this woman, for she is the tragic heroine, or anti-heroine, of the Regency. She was 24 years old, a widow and a princess of the blood. She was a figure of immense contradictions. She was beautiful, with the porcelain skin of the Bourbons, but she was also prone to rapid weight gain due to an uncontrollable eating disorder, a coping mechanism, perhaps, for the stress of her life. She was brilliant, haughty, and fiercely proud, demanding to be treated like a queen, yet she spent her nights in the darkest corners of the Parisian underworld. She was her father's daughter in every way. She shared his atheism, his wit, and his voracious sexual appetite. But while Philippe's bisexuality was grudgingly accepted as a man's vice, the Duchess of Berry's freedom was unforgivable to the misogynistic society of the 18th century. She took lovers openly, guards, counts, even her own father's favorites. She drank heavily. She threw parties at her residence, the Luxembourg Palais, that rivaled the petit souper of the Palais Royal. But the bond between father and daughter was intense. They were inseparable. Philippe, rejected by his mother, who favored his sister, and trapped in a loveless marriage, poured all his emotional energy into his daughter. He doted on her. He forgave her scandals. He gave her absolute freedom. And the world looked at this closeness, filtered it through the lens of their hatred for the regent's unnatural lifestyle, and came to a horrific conclusion: incest. The rumor didn't start in the gutter. It started in the salons of the regent's enemies. It was whispered that the Duchess of Berry was not just Philippe's daughter, but his mistress. They pointed to his indulgence of her. They pointed to the fact that she acted as the queen of his court. Then a young, ambitious poet named François-Marie Arouet, who would later become famous as Voltaire, decided to light a match. He wrote a play called Oedipus, retelling the Greek myth of the king who sleeps with his mother. When the play premiered in Paris, the audience didn't see ancient Greece, they saw the Palais Royal. Every line about forbidden love was greeted with knowing snickers. Philippe and the Duchess of Berry actually attended the premiere, sitting in the royal box, maintaining a frozen, regal composure, while the audience mocked them to their faces. It was a display of iron-willed defiance, but defiance cannot stop biology. In the early months of 1719, the Duchess of Berry fell ill. She swelled. She retreated from the public eye. The official story was a fever or dropsy. But the servants knew. The ambassadors knew. The Duchess was pregnant. For a widow with no husband, a pregnancy was a disaster. But for the Duchess of Berry, surrounded by the rumors of incest, it was a catastrophe. If the child was born, the world would ask, "Who is the father?" And the mob was already screaming the answer, the regent. The reality was likely far more mundane. The father was probably her lover, the captain of her guard, the Comte de Riom. But the truth no longer mattered. The narrative of the monster family had taken hold. The pregnancy was difficult. The Duchess was unwell, her body weakened by years of excess and the stress of the scandal. By late March 1719, she went into labor at the Luxembourg Palace. It was a nightmare. The labor went on for days. She was in agony, screaming in a room filled with terrified doctors and priests. And here, the story turns into a battle between the church and the state, fought over the body of a dying woman. The church saw its chance for revenge. The regent had sidelined the pious zealots. He had promoted the corrupt Dubois. He had allowed sin to flourish. Now, God had delivered the sinner into their hands. The curé of Saint-Sulpice, the local parish priest, arrived at the Luxembourg Palace. He was backed by the Cardinal de Noailles, a rigid moralist who hated Philippe. The priest demanded to enter the birthing chamber. He stated the law of the church. The Duchess could not receive the last rites. She could not be absolved of her sins unless she made a full confession, and that confession had to include naming the father of the child and banishing her lover, the Comte de Riom, from the palace. It was a blackmail of the soul. They were holding her salvation hostage. Philippe rushed to the Luxembourg Palace. The scene described by Saint-Simon is heart-wrenching. The most powerful man in France, the absolute ruler of the kingdom, found himself powerless against a priest. Philippe tried to negotiate. He tried to bully the cardinal. He argued that his daughter was too weak to be tormented. But the church stood firm. They wanted a public repentance. They wanted the Messalina of France to beg. Inside the room, the Duchess of Berry, writhing in pain, showed a flash of the Bourbon steel. She refused to name the father. She refused to humiliate herself or the man she loved, Riom, to satisfy the curiosity of the mob. She chose to face death without the sacraments rather than submit to their judgment. Philippe, in a desperate attempt to save her dignity, eventually ordered the forceful removal of the lover, Riom, not to appease the church, but to stop the scandal from killing her. But it was too late. The delivery was botched. The child was born dead or died shortly after, a mercy perhaps given the life it would have led. But the Duchess did not recover. The trauma of the birth, combined with the infection that set in, destroyed her. For 3 months she lingered in a twilight state, her body failing. Philippe visited her every day, watching the only person who truly understood him fade away. On July 21, 1719, Marie-Louise Elisabeth d'Orléans died. She was 23 years old. Philippe was shattered. The grief of the regent was terrible to behold. He shut himself away. But even in his grief, he could not escape the shadow of the unnatural. The autopsy of the Duchess was performed immediately, a standard procedure for royals, but it was done under intense scrutiny. The doctors found that she was pregnant again, barely a month along, a final defiant secret she had taken to the grave. The public reaction was brutal. There was no sympathy. The funeral procession was mocked. Pamphlets circulated calling her death a divine judgment. They wrote, "Here lies the mother of her country and the wife of her father." This was the turning point. The death of the Duchess of Berry broke something in Philippe. He had pushed the boundaries of the 18th century as far as they would go, and they had snapped back, hitting him with devastating force. He had tried to live as a free man on the throne, to separate his private morality from his public duty, but the world refused to let him. He was still the regent. He still held the power. But the joy was gone. The liberal regency began to darken. The police spies were quietly brought back, not to arrest sodomites, but to hunt down the authors of the libellous pamphlets. Philippe, the man who had championed free speech and released prisoners, began to censor the press. He was tired. He was grieving. And he was beginning to realize that perhaps the closet existed for a reason. Yet even in this darkness, Philippe refused to change his fundamental nature. He did not find God. He did not renounce his lovers. In fact, as the year 1720 dragged on, and the economic crisis worsened, Philippe d'Orléans threw himself into debauchery with a kind of suicidal intensity. If they were going to call him a monster, he would show them a monster. He would drink more, love harder, and care less. The stage was set for the final act of his life. The boy king, Louis XV, was growing up. The regency was ticking toward its expiration date. Philippe had saved the monarchy. He had kept the peace, but he had lost his soul in the process. And waiting in the wings was the next generation, a young king who had watched all of this, who had seen the supers, the scandals, and the chaos. Louis XV was learning a dangerous lesson, that a king's private life was a battlefield, and that pleasure was the only escape from the burden of the crown. But before the curtain could fall on Philippe, there was one final spectacular elevation to be made, the rise of Guillaume Dubois to the pinnacle of the church. It would be Philippe's last great joke on the world, forcing the pious establishment to bow down and kiss the ring of a man they considered a bisexual pimp. By the dawn of 1721, the atmosphere inside the Palais Royal had shifted from the raucous joy of a carnival to the desperate, manic energy of a ship taking on water. The system of paper money had collapsed, leaving thousands of Parisians destitute. The beloved daughter was dead, buried in the cold crypt of Saint-Denis, alongside the king she had scandalized. And Philippe d'Orléans, the man who had tried to drag France into the sunlight of the Enlightenment, found himself standing in a lengthening shadow. He was 46 years old, but he looked 60. His face, once handsome and open, was now florid and swollen, a crimson mask betraying a blood pressure that was dangerously high. He was blind in one eye, a result of the strain and the excess, and he walked with a heaviness that frightened his doctors. Yet the regent refused to slow down. If the day was for the crushing weight of statecraft, rebuilding the shattered economy, managing foreign alliances, the night was still for the oblivion of pleasure. But now there was a harder edge to the debauchery. The petit souper continued, but the laughter was brittle. Philippe was drinking not to celebrate, but to forget. He was trying to drown the ghosts of his daughter and the screams of the mob that still occasionally echoed from the street. It was in this twilight period that Philippe orchestrated his final, most audacious political maneuver. It was a move so cynical, so brilliant, and so offensive to the moral sensibilities of Europe that it stands as the crowning achievement of his queer reign. He decided to make Guillaume Dubois a prince of the church. To understand the sheer insanity of this, one must remember who Dubois was. He was not merely Philippe's prime minister. He was his shadow, his procurer, his former tutor, and, for many years, his lover. In the eyes of the French court, Dubois was a rodent. He was the son of a village doctor, a man who had clawed his way up from the gutter by holding the regent's hand, and other things. He was known to have a secret wife. He was a foul-mouthed atheist who treated the Bible as a book of fairy tales. And this was the man Philippe decided to place on the throne of St. Peter's representative in France. He wanted Dubois to be a cardinal. The process was a masterclass in corruption. Philippe needed the Pope's permission. The Pope, Clement XI, was a pious man who knew exactly who and what Dubois was. He initially refused, horrified by the idea of giving the red hat to a man whose reputation was steeped in sodomy and simony. But Philippe d'Orléans did not take no for an answer. He unleashed the full weight of French diplomacy. Millions of livres in bribes were funneled to the cardinals in Rome. Threats were made regarding the French Church's loyalty to the Vatican. Political favors were traded with the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a siege of the Vatican, led by a bisexual regent on behalf of his favorite, and eventually the walls of Rome crumbled. In July 1721, the announcement was made, Guillaume Dubois was named a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church. The ceremony in Paris was a spectacle of irony. The man who had organized the regent's orgies now knelt in velvet robes, receiving the red hat that symbolized the blood of the martyrs. The courtiers who watched whispered behind their hands, but they bowed. They had to. Philippe had proven that his will was absolute. By elevating Dubois, he was forcing the aristocracy in the church to kneel before his own personal history. He was sanctifying his vice. It was the ultimate assertion of the duo's power. The regent and his lover were now the temporal and spiritual masters of France. But while Philippe was forcing the world to respect his past, he was also carefully preparing for the future. That future lived in the Tuileries Palace, in the form of a lonely, beautiful boy named Louis XV. The relationship between Philippe d'Orléans and the young king is one of the most touching and surprising chapters of this story. The pamphlets accused Philippe of wanting to poison the boy to steal the throne. The reality was the exact opposite. Philippe loved Louis XV. He treated the boy with a tenderness and respect that the child had never received from his stiff governesses. Philippe took his duties as guardian seriously. He visited the young king every day. He explained the workings of the government to him, not talking down to him, but treating him as a future colleague. He taught the boy about science, about geography, and about the complexities of foreign courts. Louis XV, who was shy and melancholic by nature, adored his uncle. He saw past the red face and the smell of wine. He saw the brilliant mind and the genuine affection. There is a poignant anecdote from this time that illustrates their bond. During a review of the troops, the crowd cheered wildly for the young king. Philippe, riding beside the boy's carriage, leaned in and said, "Listen to them, sire. They are cheering for you. You are their master." He never tried to steal the spotlight. He was content to be the shield, the one who absorbed the hatred and the stress so that the boy could grow up safe. It was a selfless act of love from a man deemed incapable of virtue. However, Philippe also exposed the boy to the reality of the Orléans lifestyle. He did not hide who he was. Louis XV grew up watching his uncle maneuver through a world of fluid sexuality and absolute indulgence. The young king learned that power meant the freedom to satisfy one's desires. It is no coincidence that when Louis XV finally came of age, he would eventually replicate the secret, hedonistic world of his uncle, creating his own private brothels and retreating from the public eye. The seed of the later Bourbon decadence was planted during these afternoon lessons with the regent. As 1722 arrived, the regency entered its final countdown. By French law, a king reached his majority at the age of 13. Louis XV would turn 13 in February 1723. The era of Philippe's absolute rule was ending. To mark this transition, the court prepared for the coronation, the sacre. It was the most sacred ritual in the French monarchy, a ceremony dating back to the dawn of the nation. The court moved to the Cathedral of Reims. It was October 1722. The autumn air was crisp. The cathedral was ablaze with thousands of candles, the scent of incense thick enough to choke a man. Philippe stood by the altar. He was dressed in a mantle of purple velvet embroidered with gold bees. He watched as the heavy crown of Charlemagne was placed on the head of the 13-year-old boy. It was the moment Philippe had worked for. He had kept the boy alive. He had kept the throne intact. He had navigated the storms of bankruptcy and scandal, and he had delivered the king to his people. As the Te Deum rang out, swelling into the vaulted ceiling, Philippe should have felt a sense of triumph. Instead, he felt an overwhelming exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 7 years was fading. He looked at the boy, now the anointed king, and realized that his own role was diminishing. He was no longer the regent. He was just the Duke of Orléans again. But Philippe was not a man to retire to the countryside to grow cabbages. He was addicted to the game, and more importantly, he was addicted to the protection of his power. Even as the regency legally ended in February 1723, Philippe ensured that the grip of the House of Orléans did not loosen. He pulled off one last reshuffle. He resigned his title of regent, kneeling before the teenage king to return his authority. Louis XV, following the script Philippe had written for him, immediately appointed Cardinal Dubois as the Prime Minister of France. It was a seamless transition. The title changed, but the men in charge remained the same. Philippe sat on the king's council guiding the boy's hand, while Dubois ran the daily machinery of the state. The year 1723 opened with a deceptive calm. The king was crowned. The government was stable. The economic wounds of the Mississippi bubble were beginning to scar over. But inside the Palais Royal, the physical toll of the roué lifestyle was coming due. Philippe's health was collapsing. The doctors pleaded with him to stop. They told him that his blood was too thick, that his heart was struggling to pump against the deluge of food and alcohol. They begged him to bleed himself, to diet, to sleep. Philippe laughed at them. He famously said, "I would rather live for pleasure than die of boredom." He treated his body not as a temple, but as a vehicle to be driven until the wheels came off. He began to suffer from vapors, dizzy spells that would leave him grasping for furniture. He would fall asleep in meetings. His temper, usually so mild, became short. He was a man racing against the clock, trying to squeeze the last drops of sensation out of life before the darkness closed in. And the darkness struck his partner first. In August 1723, Cardinal Dubois, the invincible schemer, fell ill. It was not a dignified illness. He developed an abscess on his bladder, a painful, humiliating condition likely caused by decades of riding horses and, perhaps, the lingering effects of venereal disease. The doctors told him he needed surgery. In the 18th century, bladder surgery was a death sentence, a butchery performed without anesthesia. Dubois, terrified, refused. Philippe went to his bedside. The scene was a grim mirror of their entire relationship. Philippe, the royal prince, holding the hand of the apothecary's son, pleading with him to submit to the knife. Philippe needed Dubois. He had relied on his cunning for so long that he didn't know if he could rule without him. Finally, Dubois agreed. The surgery was a disaster. Dubois died on August 10th, 1723, screaming blasphemies at the priests who tried to offer him the last rites. Philippe was devastated. When the news was brought to him, he didn't weep publicly. Kings do not weep, but he went pale. He retreated into his cabinet and sat in silence. The other half of his soul, the dark mirror of his ambition, was gone. The court rejoiced. They hated Dubois. But Philippe knew that the buffer between him and the crushing weight of the state had been removed. With Dubois dead, the young king turned to Philippe. "My uncle," Louis XV said, "I want you to be my prime minister." Philippe accepted. He took on the full burden of the state alone. He was the regent no more, but he was now the first minister. He moved his papers into the office Dubois had vacated. He worked 18 hours a day. He met with ambassadors. He balanced the books. He reviewed the army. And at night he returned to the Palais Royal, to the arms of his new young lovers, to the heavy meals, to the sparkling wine. He was running on fumes. The courtiers noticed that his face had turned a terrifying shade of purple. He breathed heavily, a wet, rattling sound that could be heard across the room. He was a walking corpse, animated by sheer force of will and the terror of stopping. The autumn of 1723 was cold and damp. The fires in the Palais Royal roared, casting dancing shadows on the walls where the ghosts of the Regency seemed to gather. The end was near. The stage was set for the final exit of the queerest royal to ever rule France. He had outlived his father, his wife's hatred, his daughter's death, and his lover's demise. He was alone at the top of the world. And as December approached, Philippe d'Orléans prepared to face the one authority he could not charm, bribe, or seduce. The death of Cardinal Dubois in August 1723 was not merely the loss of a prime minister. For Philippe d'Orléans, it was like the removal of a vital organ. For decades, Dubois had been the filter through which the filth of the world passed before it reached the prince. Dubois had handled the spies, the bribes, the tedious negotiations with minor bishops, and the ugly, grinding machinery of the state. He had allowed Philippe to remain the visionary, the man of big ideas and grand gestures. Now, the filter was gone. The raw, unfiltered sewage of governance flowed directly onto Philippe's desk. The court at Versailles and the Palais Royal watched with bated breath to see who the regent, now legally just the Duke of Orléans, would choose as his new favorite. They expected him to elevate another lover, perhaps one of his roués, to do the heavy lifting. They expected the debauchery to spiral further out of control as he sought to fill the void left by his lifelong companion. But Philippe surprised them all. He did not choose a lover, he chose himself. In the final months of 1723, Philippe d'Orléans underwent a transformation that was as tragic as it was admirable. He became a martyr to duty. He accepted the title of prime minister, a role usually reserved for a subject, not a prince of the blood. He moved his personal office into the very rooms where Dubois had died, surrounding himself with the ghost of his friend, and he began to work with a ferocity that terrified his staff. He was up before dawn. He spent 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day bent over piles of parchment, reading dispatches from Madrid, London, and Rome. He met with the king every day, not just to chat, but to meticulously guide the 13-year-old Louis XV through the labyrinth of ruling a kingdom. Philippe was determined that when he finally let go of the reins, the boy would be ready. He was sacrificing the last remnants of his health to ensure the stability of the throne he had saved. But the physical cost was horrifying. Philippe was 49 years old, but his body was that of a man of 80. The apoplexy, what we would today call a stroke or hypertensive crisis, was visibly stalking him. His face was permanently flushed a dark, alarming crimson. His neck was swollen. His breathing was heavy and labored, a constant wheeze that filled the silence of the council chamber. He suffered from terrible drowsiness, a condition the doctors called coma vigil. He would fall asleep in the middle of sentences, his head dropping onto his chest, only to jerk awake a moment later, apologizing with a self-deprecating smile before continuing the meeting exactly where he left off. His doctors, led by the royal physician Pierre Chirac, were in a panic. They told him the truth. He was a walking time bomb. They begged him to change his lifestyle. They prescribed the standard medical torture of the 18th century, massive bloodletting, emetics to induce vomiting, and a strict diet of broth and boiled vegetables. They told him he must stop the petits soupers, he must stop the wine, he must stop the sex. Philippe listened to them with the detached curiosity of a scientist. He knew they were right. He was a chemist. He understood the mechanics of the body better than most of them. But he also understood his own soul. He looked at Chirac and delivered a philosophy that should be etched on his tombstone. He told the doctor that a life of ascetic boredom, a life of sipping broth and going to bed at 9 o'clock was a kind of death in itself. He refused to be a breathing corpse. "I will not linger," he said. "I wish to die suddenly." It was a choice. He chose intensity over duration. He chose to burn out rather than fade away. So the double life continued, but with a frantic, desperate edge. By day, he was the exhausted statesman, the dutiful uncle, the prime minister holding Europe together. By night, the doors of the Palais Royal would lock and the roués would gather, but the joy was gone. The parties in late 1723 were described by witnesses as ghostly. Philippe drank, but the wine no longer made him happy. It just made him numb. He sought out lovers, but the encounters were mechanical, driven by a need to prove he was still alive, still virile, still the regent of old. He began to exhibit a strange fatalism. He spoke of death often, not with fear, but with anticipation. He quoted the Roman poet Horace. He settled his debts. He organized his papers. He was tidying up his life, preparing for the exit. During this final dark autumn, Philippe found comfort in a new companion. Her name was the Duchess of Phalaris. She was not a great beauty like his previous mistresses, nor was she a brilliant intellectual like his mother. She was young, barely 20, with a round, pleasant face and a simple, undemanding nature. She did not ask him for money or titles. She did not nag him about his health. She simply offered him an escape. She was easy laughter in a world of heavy silence. Philippe became inseparable from her. He would sneak away from the crushing piles of state papers to spend an hour in her apartment, sitting by the fire, holding her hand, finding a brief respite from the noise of his own dying body. The court sneered at her. They called her a distraction. But for a man who had carried the weight of the world for 8 years, she was a necessary mercy. November turned to December. The cold damp of Paris settled into the bones of the city. The Palais Royal, with its high windows and drafty corridors, felt like a mausoleum. Philippe's symptoms worsened. He complained of a buzzing in his ears, of flashes of light in his vision. His temper, usually so mild and forgiving, began to fray. He snapped at secretaries. He grew impatient with the young king's tutors. The pressure inside him was building to a breaking point. On the morning of December 2nd, 1723, Philippe d'Orléans woke up feeling heavier than usual. It was a Monday. The sky was a slate gray, spitting rain. He struggled to rise from his bed. His valets dressed him in his velvet coat, his wig heavy with powder. He looked in the mirror and saw the face of a stranger, swollen, red, the eyes bloodshot, and weary. He had a full schedule. The king was at Versailles. Philippe had to travel there for a council meeting. The carriage ride was brutal on his aching body. When he arrived at Versailles, he went straight to the king's apartments. He spent the morning working with Louis XV. Witnesses said Philippe seemed distracted, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were moving underwater. After the meeting, he returned to Paris. The journey back to the Palais Royal was long. He sat in his carriage rocking with emotion, watching the gray fields pass by. He must have known, with the intuition of the doomed, that the sand in the hourglass had run out. He arrived back at the Palais Royal in the late afternoon. He was exhausted. He had a stack of papers to sign, appointments, decrees, letters to ambassadors. He sat at his desk and worked for an hour, his hands shaking as he held the quill. The ink on the page seemed to blur. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, he couldn't take it anymore. The buzzing in his head was deafening. He needed peace. He needed Phalaris. He pushed the papers aside. He told his staff he was retiring for a short while before supper. He walked down the corridor to the apartments of the Duchess of Phalaris. She was waiting for him. She had a fire crackling in the hearth. The room was warm, smelling of wood smoke and perfume. Philippe collapsed into an armchair near the fire. He sighed, a long, rattling exhalation. He looked at the Duchess and smiled, a weak, tired smile. He complained that he was feeling heavy. He asked her to tell him a story, to distract him from the pressure building behind his eyes. The Duchess sat on a low stool at his feet. She began to speak, telling him some trivial court gossip, something light and amusing. Philippe leaned his head back against the velvet cushion. He closed his eyes. The warmth of the fire washed over him. The voice of the young woman drifted in the air. This is the moment the history books usually sanitize. They say he was with his mistress. They say he fell asleep. But the reality of Philippe's life suggests that even this final moment was charged with the complexity of his nature. He was a man who had lived for the senses. He was in the room of a lover. He was seeking comfort. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The fire popped. And then suddenly Philippe's body went rigid. His eyes flew open, but they saw nothing. The apoplexy had arrived. It was not the slow decline he had feared. It was the thunderclap he had wished for. The Duchess of Phalaris stopped speaking. She looked up. She saw the prince's face turn a terrifying shade of purple. She saw him slump forward, sliding from the chair. She screamed. Her scream echoed through the Palais Royal, a sound that marked the end of an era. But the doors were thick and the servants were far away. For a few agonizing minutes, the ruler of France, the man who had defied God and king to live as he pleased, lay on the floor of a boudoir, dying as he had lived, amidst scandal, intimacy, and the chaotic pursuit of connection. The scream of the Duchess of Phalaris did not just pierce the silence of the Palais Royal, it shattered the fragile illusion of order. Valets, hearing the distress, hammered on the door before bursting in. They found the most powerful man in Europe slumped on the floor, his face a dark, congested purple. He was not dead, but he was no longer Philippe d'Orléans. He was a biological machine in catastrophic failure. The doctors arrived moments later, running with their lancets and useless potions, turning the boudoir into a slaughterhouse of futile medical rituals. They tore open his shirt and sliced into his veins, desperate to bleed the apoplexy out of him. But the pressure within his skull did not relent. For a brief, agonizing hour, the regent lingered in a coma untethered from the world, until at roughly 7 o'clock in the evening, the rattling finally stopped. The heart that had loved so many and feared so little, beat its last. The regent had made his escape, but even as the body began to cool, the battle over the narrative of his death was already beginning. The official story, the one that would be printed in the Gazette de France and sent to the courts of Madrid and London, was scandalous enough. The regent had died in the arms of his mistress, the Duchess of Phalaris. It was a death that fit the roué reputation, a libertine prince, dying in a moment of romantic intimacy. It was a story that allowed the moralists to wag their fingers and say, "See, the wages of sin is death." However, buried deep within the archives of the Bastille, in the dusty reports of the police spies who monitored the regent's every move, there lies a different story. These secret dispatches, written by men whose job was to know the truth rather than the propaganda, suggest that the scene in the boudoir was more crowded than the official history admits. They whisper that the Duchess was a cover. They suggest that the person truly closest to the regent at the moment of his collapse was not a woman, but a young male favorite, possibly his current paramour, the Marquis de Clermont, or a young page from his household. According to this shadow history, the regent died mid-act, or at least in the midst of an intimate encounter with a man. If true, the presence of the Duchess of Phalaris was a frantic improvisation, a beard summoned to the room by loyal servants to ensure that the regent did not die in a compromising tableau that would have destroyed the dignity of the royal family. It suggests that even in his final moments, Philippe d'Orléans was forced to navigate the duality that had defined his entire existence: the public performance of heterosexual royalty versus the private reality of his queer identity. The most openly bisexual ruler in history may have had his final truth sanitized by the very machinery he had commanded. Regardless of who held his hand as he died, the news of his passing hit the Tuileries Palace like a physical blow. The person most affected was not a lover or a minister, but the 13-year-old king, Louis XV. When the courtiers brought him the news, the boy king collapsed in a flood of tears. This is the most profound vindication of Philippe's character. The wicked uncle, the man accused of poisoning heirs and plotting to steal the crown, was mourned by the monarch as a second father. Louis XV sobbed uncontrollably, crying out, "I have lost everything. I have lost the only man who truly loved me." It was a rare moment of raw emotion from a boy who had been trained to be a statue. In his grief, Louis refused to see anyone for hours, a testament to the genuine warmth Philippe had provided in a cold transactional world. But the machinery of state does not pause for grief. The moment Philippe's heart stopped, the vultures began to circle. The Duke of Bourbon, a one-eyed, dim-witted cousin who hated Philippe, immediately marched to the king's apartments and demanded to be made prime minister. The body of the regent was not even cold, yet the power transfer was brutal and instant. The liberal experiment was over. The era of tolerance, of scientific inquiry, and of relative peace was about to be replaced by a harsher, more incompetent regime. The following day, the ritual of the autopsy began. In the 18th century, the bodies of royal princes were public property. Philippe's corpse was opened up by the surgeons, his organs removed and weighed, his secrets laid bare on a marble slab. The medical report reads like an indictment of his lifestyle. The doctors noted that his liver was destroyed, his stomach ruined, and his heart, the seat of his passions, was encased in fat and strangely small. They concluded that his blood was heated and thick. It was a physiological confirmation of what everyone already knew. Philippe had burned the candle at both ends until the flame consumed him. His heart was placed in a silver urn and taken to the Val de Grace convent, while his body was prepared for burial at the Royal Basilica of Saint Denis. The funeral procession was grand, as befitted a grandson of France, but the atmosphere in the streets of Paris was chilling. There were no tears from the public. The mob, who had once cheered him as a hero and then reviled him as a tyrant, watched the hearse pass with a sullen silence. They remembered the Mississippi bubble. They remembered the hunger. They remembered the rumors of incest. A particularly cruel couplet circulated in the taverns that night, serving as a bitter epitaph from the people he had tried to rule. Here lies Philippe, who lived without faith and died without time for repentance. It was a harsh judgment on a man who had kept the peace in Europe for 8 years and saved the dynasty from extinction. But Philippe had never courted the love of the mob. He had only sought to keep them fed and quiet, and in the end, he had failed at the latter. Yet, as the heavy stone of the crypt at Saint Denis slid into place, sealing Philippe II d'Orléans into the darkness of history, his influence did not vanish. In fact, it was only just beginning to metastasize. Philippe had been a containment vessel. He had absorbed the shocks of the transition from the grand century to the age of enlightenment. He had held the contradictions of the monarchy together with his own charisma. Now that he was gone, the trauma he had suppressed began to leak out into the bloodstream of the royal family. The legacy of the queer regent was not found in laws or monuments, but in the DNA of the monarchy itself. He had broken the mold of what a king could be. He had shown that a ruler could be an intellectual, a skeptic, and a libertine. He had shattered the divine aura of the Sun King and replaced it with something human, messy, and vulnerable. Most dangerously, he had left behind a blueprint for living a double life. The young Louis XV, wiping his tears in the Tuileries, was now alone. He was the absolute master of France. And as he grew into manhood, the lessons of his uncle began to manifest in strange and specific ways. The boy who had watched Philippe navigate the petits soupers and the secret passageways of the Palais Royal would soon begin to construct his own private world. Louis XV would not be open like Philippe. He lacked his uncle's brazen courage, but he would be equally driven by a need to separate his private pleasure from his public duty. The Orléans vice, as it was politely called, did not die with Philippe. It simply went underground, burrowing deep into the foundations of Versailles. The baton had been passed. The House of Orléans had shown that the royal blood could carry a queer strain, a desire for the forbidden that no amount of prayer or etiquette could suppress. Philippe had been the explosion. What followed was the radioactive fallout. As we stand at the grave of the regent, we must look forward to the strange mutations that his example produced. We must look to the next generation, to the boy king, who is now growing up, and to the secrets he will soon hide in the Park of Versailles. We must look to the Parc aux Cerfs, the Stag Park, where the next chapter of royal LGBT history waits to be written. Philippe II d'Orléans was the only one to rule while living his truth, but he ensured that those who followed him would never be content with the lie of heterosexual piety again. The queerest royal was dead, but the queer monarchy was just waking up.